Thank you very much. Dear Chairman,
You're welcome.
Thank you. Dear Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all I want to say that it's such a great honor for me to be here, to be invited by you, and I thank you very much for this opportunity here. This presentation now will focus on the new insights into blood vessels, and I try to answer why infused fluids and macromolecules leak out of the vessel and why we should take care of this. These questions address the vascular barrier and the endothelial glycocalyx. In the past decades, we have already learned a lot about the structure of the vascular barrier. By using electron microscopic views, we could see that endothelial cells, which are connected by so-called tight junctions, build up a confluent layer which acts as a competent barrier between interstitial space and the intravascular space. The function of this barrier was explained to us already 100 years ago by Ernest Starling with his single barrier concept. Starling told us that in the vessel there is a high hydrostatic pressure driving fluid out of the vessel, which is opposed by a colloid osmotic pressure gradient. In the vessel there is a higher oncotic pressure due to high concentrations of albumin than in the interstitial space, and this keeps the fluid within the vessel, the high oncotic pressure in the vessel. But can you see an endothelial glycocalyx in this model? Of course not. The glycocalyx was discovered a long time after Ernest Starling. Already 50 years ago, the investigators of the microvasculature considered the endothelial glycocalyx to be a small, insignificant structure attached to the endothelial surface due to its thickness of less than 30 nanometers, visible in electron microscopy. This structure looked like a very, very short grasp upon endothelial cells, having only a minor impact on circulation. So, by using a new By using a new fixation technique, however, we visualized an endothelial glycocalyx in the coronary system of the guinea pig heart with a thickness of more than 400 nanometers. Here you can see myocardial tissue, here, and here you can see capillaries with a thick endothelial glycocalyx. Now you see a capillary and a glycocalyx at a higher magnification. Obviously, you can see the glycocalyx can be thicker than the endothelial cells themselves. It looks more like a tall forest in microcirculation than a short grass. Today it's already known that this structure is built up by glycosaminoglycans and of proteoglycans. The syndican 1 acts like the trunk of a tree and is rooted in endothelial cells. And the heparon sulfates can be compared with the branches and the leaves of this tree. Of course, the question arises, why was the real thickness of this structure unknown for such a long time? The answer is it is an extremely fragile structure. Before any conventional electron microscopic picture can be taken, we always have to fix the tissue. However, conventional fixation fluids destroy the glycocalyx. And if we take a picture now, we cannot see the glycocalyx. And if we don't see any structure, we don't assume a thick glycocalyx in the vessels. Also, the experimental model which is used is extremely important. Here you can see endothelial cell cultures. Obviously, only a very small rudimentary glycocalyx grows up in these experiments without any shear stress. In contrast thereto, the same cells in a complete organ, as can be seen in these human umbilical veins, build up a large glycocalyx having a thickness of more than 1,000 nanometers. So a healthy glycocalyx is impressively thick, but what is its impact on vascular permeability? The experimental model we choose to answer this question was that of the isolated guinea pig heart, prepared and retrogradely perfused in a modified Langendorf mode at a constant perfusion pressure of 80 centimeters of water. This preparation gives direct access to the net fluid filtration out of the vessel in an intact vascular bed. Net fluid, it is interstitial fluid, appears at the epicardial surface and can be collected as the so-called transudate. Colloids and drugs like heparinase or histamine could be applied into the aortic feed line intravascularly. The impact of the application of heparinase was a visible destruction of the glycocalyx, as we demonstrated in these electron microscopic images. There's no glycocalyx anymore. The application of histamine is a well-known intervention to cause intercellular gap formation. So the results of these experiments is here. It's the double barrier concept concerning vascular permeability. Our data led us to identify the endothelial glycocalyx as a second barrier against fluid and colloid extravasation. The double barrier concept describes muscular permeability being controlled by two competent barriers, the endothelial glycocalyx and the endothelial cell line. Altering only one barrier, the endothelial glycocalyx by heparinase or the endothelial cell line by histamine, did not have much impact on the barrier function in our experiments. Altering both seemed to overwhelm the compensation capacity of the lymphatic system. Fluid extravasation increased in our model, and tissue edema should occur in vivo. So according to the common physiological knowledge about Starling's principle, we addressed next the impact of different colloids on vascular permeability. Again, we used the isolated guinea pig heart, but now in a flow constant perfusion mode, to derive a net fluid filtration from applying different perfusion pressures and measuring the resulting fluid extravasation. In an unphysiological, total colloid-free perfusion mode, the destruction of the glycocalyx did not change pressure-dependent fluid filtration at all. Heparinase had no effect. As a result, without protein, the glycocalyx has no barrier function. In contrast, infusing albumin dramatically decreased the net fluid filtration. And this effect was partly, but not completely lost after destruction of the glycocalyx. Here's an extremely low scatter you see. Destruction of the endothelial glycocalyx also significantly increased the colloid loss per unit of time across the endothelial barrier in these experiments. So the facts up to now are: firstly, the endothelial glycocalyx needs intravascular colloid to act as a second barrier against fluid extravasation, and second, it prevents colloids from leaving the vasculature. So what's remaining after subtraction of the special knowledge of the glycocalyx? To avoid transvascular fluid loss, we have to provide a sufficient intravascular level of colloid osmotic force. Well, this is not more than the good old Starling principle, but this is no reason to turn away the focus from the glycocalyx concerning vascular permeability. Some surprises are waiting for us, questioning this very old principle. The first Starling contradiction resulted from measuring and comparing the colloid concentrations in interstitial and intravascular spaces. As everybody knows, the inward directed force opposing the hydrostatic pressure driving fluid out of the vessel is a colloid osmotic pressure gradient between interstitial and intravascular spaces. Surprisingly, the colloid concentrations we measured in the transudate, in the interstitial fluid of the coronary transudate, were not significantly different to those we applied intracoronarily after an equilibration interval of about 20 minutes. There was no measurable differences in behavior between human albumin and hydroxyethylstarch. Moreover, via immunohistochemistry we could demonstrate that intravascularly applied human albumin crosses the interstitial space on its way to the epicardial surface within a short period of time. The right-hand panel here shows the albumin distribution in myocardium after 15 minutes perfusion with albumin and 5 minutes without. As can be seen in the left-hand panel, guinea pig albumin showed no positive antibody reaction. Consequently, we found that the intravascular albumin concentration equals that in the interstitial space. Is this now the end of Starling's concept? Before answering this question, let's have another look at our data to get a further surprise. Again, we used the flow constantly perfused isolated guinea pig heart. The glycocalyx was intact in these sets of experiments. What we did now was to intracoronarily apply different levels of colloid osmotic pressure to determine the resulting pressure-dependent fluid extravasation. Logically, a colloid-free perfusate generates a colloid osmotic pressure of 0. Replacing 1/3 of the buffer volume by 6% hydroxyethyl starch developed a very high colloid osmotic force in the vessel. As to be expected, the artificial colloid led to a decrease in net fluid filtration. But what would be the impact of human albumin? Let's have another look at the respective colloid osmotic forces. Albumin at a comparable concentration provides only half of the colloid osmotic pressure than hydroxyethyl starch. Consequently, one should expect this natural colloid to lie between saline and starch concerning pressure-dependent fluid extravasation. We found the opposite. Albumin was much more effective in preventing transvascular fluid loss despite providing only an intravascular colloid osmotic pressure being only half of that provided by our hydroxyethyl starch preparation. So I was really completely surprised and wondered what would happen if we halve again the colloid osmotic pressure in the albumin group. We were sure that this now will diminish the impact of albumin tightening on vascular sealing. Again, we've got a very surprising result. The net fluid filtration was the same with both albumin preparations. So, the intravascular colloid osmotic pressure obviously does not determine fluid filtration. The kind of the applied colloid seemed to be much more important. And there's a very interesting finding by other authors which can explain why albumin is superior in decreasing fluid filtration to hydroxyethyl starch in our experiments. Due to absorbed plasma proteins, the glycocalyx forms a gel, a layer, we term it endothelial surface layer, with its own colloid osmotic force. However, the glycocalyx interacts in a completely different manner with artificial colloids, as large dextran or hydroxyethyl starch molecules. Artificial colloids do not enter the glycocalyx. In contrast thereto, albumin, probably due to its molecular weight and special charge properties, enters the glycocalyx and forms the highly competent colloid osmotic active barrier, the endothelial surface layer. Consequently, the colloid osmotic competence of the endothelial surface layer determines fluid filtration. Another fact counterintuitive to Starling's principle. So again, the question arises, is this the end? Well, I do not think so, but it needs a revision. We've got some help from Adamson and co-workers who performed some experiments and confocal microscopic imaging in the isolated, non-fenestrated red mesenteric microvessel. He and others before found some evidence that albumin could be filtered at the endothelial glycocalyx. The ultrafiltrate has only a very low colloidosmotic force and is funneled into small, infrequent breaks in the junction strand. So, Starling was not wrong in assuming an oncotic pressure outside the circulating part of the plasma to determine fluid filtration, but he did not know the endothelial glycocalyx. Today, we recognize her existence. So a modern version of his principle should take this structure into consideration and take the colloidosmotic force within the small space below the glycocalyx as the relevant opponent of the intravascular colloidosmotic pressure. So Starling's gradient works across the glycocalyx and not across the whole endothelial barrier. However, the glycocalyx has much more power than just to regulate the density of blood vessels. The glycocalyx forms a sheath with captured proteins, which keeps all flowing blood cells in distance from endothelial cells. Normally, the very small adhesion molecules are harbored within this large structure. Obviously, this makes the glycocalyx very important concerning inflammation and coagulation. Additionally, the endothelial glycocalyx acts as a sensor for shear stress NO release. The structure of the glycocalyx correlates with this function, as can be seen if the glycocalyx is destroyed. This produces a direct contact of flowing blood cells with endothelial cells, leukocyte and platelet adhesion, loss in vascular resistance, and an increase in vascular permeability. The destruction of the glycocalyx leads to a release of glycocalyx components like syndecan-1 into the circulation. Atrial natriuretic peptide is a cardiac peptide which is released during volume loading due to an increase in cardiac preload. And this plays a key role in blood volume regulation, and I will address this in my next presentation in detail again. We could already demonstrate that AMP can destroy the glycocalyx. There was an increase in freely flowing syndecan-1, the trunk of the tree, into the circulation of the guinea pig heart in comparison to a control group without damage of the glycocalyx due to AMP. And here you can see capillaries of a control heart having a thick endothelial glycocalyx, and the exposure of AMP led to a visible destruction of the glycocalyx. Consequently, AMP cuts down the trunk of the tree of the glycocalyx. The result of this alteration of the vascular barrier is an ongoing increase in net fluid filtration here, in comparison to control hearts with intact glycocalyx. And this leads to the development of an impressive interstitial edema. So one important question is now, can shedding of the glycocalyx occur in human beings? In order to answer this, we investigated patients during cardiac surgery, with or without cardiopulmonary bypass. As you can see here, there was no difference in demographic data. The duration of surgery was equal between both groups, and in patients with bypass, this took 90 minutes with a cross-clamp time of 60 minutes. The measurement points were highly standardized in both groups, namely measurements at baseline, the induction of anesthesia, onset of bypass, central anastomosis, end of bypass, and surgical hemostasis, and postoperatively. In the group without bypass, instead of measurements before bypass, a measuring point after the application of the surgical stabilizer was used. And here are the results. After removal of the aortic cross-clamp, there was a large and significant increase in both glycocalyx components here. with a maximum increase at the end of cardiopulmonary bypass. Presumably, the transient increase in syndicate-1 and heparan sulfate in the circulation can be explained by a proteolytic degradation of the glycocalyx with a subsequent rapid clearance, especially via the kidneys. In the group without bypass, there was also significant but a lower shedding of the glycocalyx components. In this investigation, besides the components of the glycocalyx, also the plasma concentrations of AMP and of the cytokines interleukin 6, 8 and 10 were measured at the different measuring points. And here you can see the relative extent of parameter changes at time point 2, which was the onset of the bypass in the on-pump group. In the group with cardiopulmonary bypass, you can clearly see that, first of all, AMP increased with a following shedding of the glycocalyx components. The cytokines remain almost stable at this moment. So, in this special case, these cytokines were not the early trigger for the shedding of the glycocalyx. However, we will later see that an inflammation is an additional important hit for the glycocalyx. Obviously, the glycocalyx can be damaged in human beings perioperatively, and the measurement of syndicate-1 and heparan sulfate concentrations in blood plasma may represent a new diagnostic tool for detecting this effect. So, what is now the impact of the glycocalyx during major inflammation like sepsis? The classical knowledge about the pathophysiology of sepsis obviously does not include the glycocalyx. However, we have to ask what is the impact of the glycocalyx in the development of sepsis. In order to answer this question, we performed a prospective study including healthy volunteers, patients with sepsis, severe sepsis, and septic shock. And here you can see the demographic data according to the Apache multi-organ dysfunction and so forth score. You can see the increasing severity of illness in patients with sepsis, severe sepsis, and septic shock. And here you can see the increase in freely flowing syndicate-1, which is the trunk of the tree of the glycocalyx and is rooted in the endothelial cells. There's a dramatic increase in the circulating blood, which is correlated with the increase in severity of illness. Free-flowing heparan sulfate increases also in sepsis, severe sepsis and septic shock. Probably a rapid clearance via the urine attenuated a bit its correlation with the increasing severity of illness. Obviously, severe inflammation led to a dramatic destruction of the glycocalyx with negative impact on the outcome of the patients. It is a strong negative predictor for outcome in patients with sepsis and septic shock. So based on different experimental investigations, we could already demonstrate that TNF-alpha, endotoxins, as well as the activation of leukocytes and ischemia reperfusion injuries are main triggers for the destruction of the endothelial leukocalyx. The result of this damage is a breakdown of the vascular barrier and consequently a major capillary leakage. To conclude, it seems to be important to develop strategies for the protection of this important structure in the circulation. Here you can see that ischemia reperfusion maneuvers can destroy the glycocalyx ischemia in the guinea pig out. And this is indicated by a major release of syndicate-1 and heparan sulfate into the circulation during reperfusion. However, if hydrocortisone or antithrombin was applied intracoronarily, this resulted in an impressive stabilization of the endothelial leukocalyx. This was even a visible effect. Here you can see electron microscopic views of a thick glycocalyx in the control heart. And this after ischemia reperfusion. The glycocalyx is destroyed. Pre-treatment with hydrocortisone or antithrombin prevented the destruction of the glycocalyx during ischemia reperfusion. This glycocalyx protection stabilizes the vascular barrier, leading to a decrease in tissue edema and to protective effects concerning blood cell adhesion. For example, ischemia reperfusion led to an increase in leukocyte adhesion here. Sorry, I've lost my way. In a further experimental setting, we could demonstrate that the application of hydrocortisone and antithrombin after ischemia reperfusion also decreased the leukocyte adhesion after reperfusion. In further experimental settings, it could already be demonstrated that besides hydrocortisone and antithrombin, also albumin, medical NO, or even sevoflurane are able to protect the structure. These findings may become important for further clinical studies. So please let me summarize. Fluids and macromolecules leak if the glycocalyx is destroyed. And this is a really big structure in the vasculature which was completely underestimated in the past. An intact glycocalyx is essential for maintaining a colloidosmotic pressure gradient which is necessary for limiting fluid extravasation. And by covering adhesion molecules, the glycocalyx prevents thrombocyte and leukocyte adhesion, which makes this structure to a key element in inflammation and coagulation processes. Damage to the glycocalyx can occur in humans during ischemia reperfusion, inflammation, and during the perioperative period. A destruction of the glycocalyx, however, can be a key trigger for the development of macro and microangiopathies. The most evident example is the angiopathy during sepsis and septic shock. However, it can be assumed that the endothelial glycocalyx has also an important role in the development of arteriosclerosis, angiogenesis, and tumor metastasis. Today, the protection of this large structure is already possible. These all are options to achieve this target. However, we have to be aware that the clinical impact of the protection of the endothelial glycocalyx for health and disease has not been explored so far. Thank you very much for your attention.